No.
Distintos espantos. Si no entiendes, amor, las lenguas con las que te acaricio, no las cortes que no vuelven a nacer, vienen de un trozo de astro distinto, de la condena de los desaparecidos. Cada sílaba es un pájaro migrando al sur, reposando en tu hombro, reclamando un poco de agua. No las espantes, no borres sus nidos de tu boca, que después sus hijos no sabrán volver a ti. Love, if you do not understand the tongues with which I caress you, do not cut them, they will not bloom again. They come from a different piece of star, from the condemnation of the missing. Each syllable is a bird migrating south, resting on your shoulder, claiming for some water. Don't hush them away. Do not erase their nest from your mouth. Afterwards, their children won't know how to return to you. You and I were not the same ghost, but we learned to reflect one another. Do not look for my origin. Do not try to translate the dialects of my people. Let them dance on your body all night. Let them get lost in your fury for a lifetime. Let them weave together with their blood the pieces of you that fell apart in the war. But please, do not consider yourself an archaeologist every time I take you into my core. And if at times it is only foolish noises calling you, only storms, sneezes, and shipwrecks, or in one corner a rabid dog licking his paws and the rest just fire, what do you get from making a cage? What do you get from taming the scream? With which arrow are you trying to put out the sun? If you do not understand, love, the tongues with which I caress you, maybe we're the fire that's already dying. Maybe the curse of the ancestors came true. Maybe we already reached the end of the world and didn't even notice. Hi, and welcome to the Neverstop Hour. It never stops happening. My name is Elizabeth Torres. I also go by the moniker of Madam Neverstop, and I'm talking to you from Multimedia in Torres, where we are celebrating at the French Festival. This is my second time here, and I'm delighted to be a part of it because it's such a vivid opportunity of encountering fellow creators and poets, and contemporary artists of all sorts who come from different parts of the world to not just create, but also share their recent experiences and feed from one another, which always leads to new collaborations, what I call world writing. And all of this, to me, is pretty much the basis of what I try to do with my own work. To introduce myself first, of course, I'm a poet. That's the main thing. I'm a multimedia artist, I'm a translator. So that means I'm also a musician and a visual artist. I make really good food and I love traveling and dreaming. I've been dreaming since I was a child. I'm originally from Colombia, 2,600 meters closer to the stars. I was raised in Bogotá, in the middle of the social conflict, which means that I was surrounded by incredibly dark news on the TV and pessimism from all areas, which fed the belief of wanting to do something different than adults were doing or than everybody else around me was doing. And poetry was the exit because Colombia actually has a very vivid cultural environment, maybe because of the wars and the constant social conflict. So from independent magazines and concerts to cultural houses where you can go and listen to storytelling and poetry. And I grew up surrounded by all of this at the same time to counteract the violence. So I started writing and publishing at a young age, and the Ministry of Culture of Colombia published my first book. I had published a few cassettes and CDs before. I was 8 years old when this book came out, and someone had the bright idea of sending it to the contest of national poetry, and no one knew to ask for ages. So my book won the National Poetry Award, and I became a well-known national poet at the age of 9. which means I traveled around the country and started participating in TV, newspapers, all sorts of interviews, conferences, and giving workshops with some of the main authors I had always admired. A very privileged existence, a very confusing existence. And in the meantime, I got to meet all these other people who were either struggling to cope with their realities and finding hope in my poetry and coming to me and telling me that I made a difference in their life. Or I also met people who, by their own art, made a difference in my life. And I understood that poetry can be savior, that poetry can be almost like a religion when there is nothing else. I started receiving death threats and soon after left the country, thanks to an invitation to a TV show in a Spanish news channel. And as soon as my family and I arrived to the United States for this TV show, we said no to the TV show because it was a competition with children, and I don't like competing. Um, and applied for political refuge. That's I guess, a very marking part in my identity because I have learned to really care for the subject of migration and how we really don't belong to one specific place, but we carry with us, even not in our luggage, but in our head and in our heart, the entire concept of territorial agency and identity. And I had to develop all these concepts at a very young age when learning a new language so I could translate for my family and when learning a new way of existing and moving around for a completely different culture. This led to me understanding that poetry could also save me, not just for the fact that I became a refugee thanks to it, but because it was the only language that I fully understood. And for several years, I continued as a teenager performing at night in bars and clubs and also in cultural houses and schools all around the States, telling my story, afterwards also in English, and finding an audience in that new country that I then called my home. Before I continue, I want to share with you another poem. This one is from In the Jaws of Oblivion. The hallucinated, the voracious, a city in ruins and you in its center, the insatiable, endless nightmare that leaves you hallucinating in screams, the unbearable, the stench of inclements after the war, the taste of flesh between your teeth, and yet hunger, the violent, the uncertainty of the victim and of guilt, the inexorable, the corpse of your corpse and a row of shadows that no longer belong to you, the irreversible. 100 years have passed and it doesn't stop raining. The intermittent, the image, the glare, the apparition right before the shock. The incoherent, you still don't know if it's oblivion or death the one showing you its teeth. The sordid, you already learned to surrender, but you prefer to sharpen your hooves. What do you fear, love, if not love? The concave, in the periphery, all reality is temporary. Your status of ennobled heart expires at midnight. Where do you go when you forget you don't want to leave anymore? The concrete, instead of virtue, panic. Instead of tearing, the fissure. And from this side, slowly, reconstruction. That is the collapse on repeat. That is the collapse on repeat. Thus begin the days of the offering, the uncertain. What color is this part of the story? Moving to New York meant, or to the States meant visualizing the process or the tools that I had for me to coexist with. It wasn't just poetry, it was visual art because I believed that's visual poetry. So all the poems that I write usually are accompanied by drawings, illustrations, or doodles at least. And now I had two languages to work with, which meant also two identities or two very different voices. For some reason, I kind of have noticed that are more maybe romantic, maybe more melancholic, maybe more dramatic with the Spanish, and maybe more sarcastic and flirtatious, maybe younger with my American English poetry. And so I like to combine the two for the nurturing party type of feeling of my poems. And this has helped me develop my very personal style of poetry. But another thing that I learned through my arrival in the States is that I enjoyed the journalism or the documentation of every aspect of life, not just being in front of a camera. This is not the favorite part, actually, but more like being behind the scenes and learning of all the people around me and their stories, how much they had to share and what they had to teach me, and how by talking about it, we could maybe find some sparks or some ideas that could lead us to collaborate or work together and build maybe a different reality. And it's not that hero concept that we alone are going to save the world, but we save our daily reality. And I think that's more than enough every day. I went to school for media and film for that reason, the whole journalism attraction, with a focus on broadcast. I've always been interested in radio and had a radio show in Miami. And I also went to school for fine arts. Even if they say it was a waste of time, I think it was absolutely worth it because it showed me the corruption of public universities in the States and how quickly they're closed for political agendas. Places like the fine art department. I finally learned the life drawing and the original tools of how to create art, which I think is really important because we don't really need to invent everything. We just need to use the tools that are all around us, take advantage of them, and turn them into something moldable. Living in the United States also led me to have access to tons of information that I hadn't learned before or known of before, which, of course, by reading English, facilitated the process of arriving to books of William Burroughs and the Beat poets, who have become a huge influence in my work unintentionally. But also, if you combine it with readings of Gabriela Mistral and Alejandra Pizarnik, then you can really kind of just trip on your own for entire days. And then if you also look at Remedios Varo and films of Alejandro Jodorowsky, you see that this is all encompassing poetry. And this poetry in itself becomes a ritual, and this ritual in itself becomes life. I have become so submerged with this concept of poetry as a savior that I think that every step that I do and every action that I take is a poetry takeover. Before I continue, I will read you another poem. This one is from The Waves of the Firefly. It's my most recent book, published by Moloko Print in German and in English. Inheritance. This eagerness, that exhaustion, a few of those pebbles on the road, the bricks of that wall, the candlelit secret, this warm feeling, that candid memory, those hideous shoes, a dentist's appointment, an insect name, a silence, the tap definitely, a sunset or an entire collection of them, we pasted onto the pages of a book no one will look through, an urgent need for an attorney, a hole in the ground which is my castle, a reflection of light sometimes. This rage, that anger, those fears, the look of the neighbors, a letter, the social responsibility, one single moment of truth in a collection of moments of truth behind the curtain. A magic trick, a disappearance act, a transferring of pain. What if not the whole world, all of it? And I say no, and I say why, and I scream like a deranged spirit, but I still go along with it. All of it, mine. After several years of traveling as a poet, I've had the opportunity of visiting over 30 countries just with my poetry, to universities and cultural festivals and French festivals in places like Macau or places like here, and meeting all these incredibly interesting people who kept talking about the same subjects again and again, but didn't know that they were doing the same things. I realized maybe I can do something about it. I came up with something very clever at the time in New York in 2010, 2009, a virtual magazine, an online magazine. And people laughed at me a lot because they couldn't understand why I would ever make a magazine that was just online when everything needed to be printed at the time. But I realized this is the only funds I have. I can pay for a domain, and I can begin interviewing people and sharing this with others. And people started responding from all over the world, from Russia, from China, from Latin America, from Europe, and submitting their content. And for the past 10 years, I have continued running Red Door Magazine as a platform for independent artists to share their work without a mediator, without any ads, without any prices in between, just as a place for all of us to connect. And the fact that I created this also opened so many doors. It allowed me to put myself in a different position where I wasn't just a poet wanting to perform in a different place or in a place they invited me to, but I had something to offer. This is one of the tools that has made a huge impact in my life. It's the documentation aspects. Because of the interest in music, I also joined a couple bands in New York, and I played with a band called Electric Set. And Electric Set was traveling also with Indian Jewelry and a few other bands from the States, a tour around Europe. And I kind of got tired of New York at that time because of the heavy racist vibes that were happening very close to me. I felt followed, persecuted. We were, raided even in our apartment in New York. And a lot of our friends, we had to bail them out over time just because they were Black, just because they were brown, just because they were women. And I figured I need to continue my work, but continue it elsewhere. And touring Europe allowed me to arrive in Copenhagen, which is the second huge migration in my life. And at the beginning, of course, the conflicts of language and territory and agency are very strong. And so I began researching my purpose there. What exactly is it that, not just what I want for myself, but what can I offer a community that's completely different to the other cities or places where I had grown up or existed. And I actually found that creating a space for artists that was not just the local artists or just the international artists or a very fancy gallery was very necessary. So I opened, before even moving completely to Copenhagen, I opened with a few other artists a Red Door Studios, and soon after a Red Door Gallery, and this led to me actively moving to Copenhagen, where I now exist and function. And Red Door Gallery now continues to be a venue for poetic events and music, and of course exhibitions, workshops, and now in this upcoming future, we'll see what other potential it has to offer. But because of the radio part, the interest of the radio, I thought maybe having a magazine, having a gallery, and having a bunch of books and making art and making music wasn't busy enough. So I decided to start a podcast. And the podcast has been functioning for over a year now. It's called the Red Transmissions Podcast. And I know that this is something I could have done a long time before due to my interest in radio, but I never really dared because I was used to the big studio and all the complications required and the budget required to have a radio show. Suddenly the technology arrived to the point where everyone either listens to podcasts or has one. And why not? Me as well. And so I started with the Red Transmissions Podcast and have had the chance of providing even one more platform for artists. And this is not just upcoming artists, but incredibly successful ones who still want to reach a different audience and talk about their creative process and talk about their current projects and talk about their reference and the things that in other interviews and locations where they're just doing book tours and stuff, they wouldn't have the chance to talk about. So it has been a very enlightening experience to have had the possibility to work on all of these things together. And the reason why I call it Never Stop is because it's almost like a one-shot film, which was the original concept of Never Stop. It was Brandon Davis, a musician, part of the Electric Set, who came up with the Never Stop concept. But I kind of adopted it because back then I was Miss Never Stop, and he was Mr. And when we broke up, I figured I can't quit being Miss Never Stop. So I just figured I'm gonna age with this title. I want to age elegantly. I will call it Madam Neverstop and turn it into my actual philosophy. And what Neverstop is, if it's a one-shot film of life, then what I can do is create a very specific rotational schedule of life and how it works. And how it works is every month or so I have to release an episode, two episodes a month. 4 times a year I have to release a magazine. All of the time I have to write unless I can't write, in which case I'm painting, which is also poetry. I don't really do shows of my own because for a long time I have kept it as an internal narration of my mental state of decay or delirium. But everything else is quite public, and I am also very fortunate that my poetry is quite productive. It comes in big groups and it comes with concepts and it comes with very direct messages. And once I present it to publishers, they're kind enough to accept it, which is why I have published over 20 books in my life at the age of 32. And by 33, I have one more book coming out at the beginning of the year, also by Moloko Print in Germany. It's called Would You Like to Come Home? It's called Would You Like to Come Home? And this book specifically is a book of the dead to complete another part of the transition and translation of what my life has become to, because during the life to Copenhagen, which I thought was going to be the paradise aspect, I also had to face grief directly in the face and sorrow and crash into adult mode, bills, and inherit all these other issues and traumas and anxieties that I didn't know were so incredibly human. So whether I succumb to them or transform them into more poetry, I guess is my daily choice. That is what this new book, The Ways of the Firefly, talks about. But because all of that was not enough for me, and then COVID happened, I of course started missing performing on stage, being with fellow poets and fellow artists, listening to them perform, and the exchanges that happen in between, but simply their voices, because they fill my head and carry me everywhere I go. I realized that maybe it wasn't just me stuck at home not hearing any poetry, but all of us everywhere in the world. So I made an open call for my own personal collection of poetry, audio recordings of poetry. This is inspired very much so by my upbringing and my origin in Colombia, because there is a house in Colombia called the Casa de Poesía Silva, which has a very beautiful phonoteca library of cassettes. And you arrive and you're giving a Walkman and you put on your headphones and then you ask for which poet you want to hear of the Latin American poets, and then you can hear their voices reciting their own work. And that really completed, as a child that I was, the combination of audio and poetry collection, the archiving, the documentation, but also the current aspect right now of what is in our heads as poets, what is in our minds as creators, right now that we're all isolated and in facing new levels of uncertainty that in our current time we hadn't had to. The Phonotic now, the Poetic Phonotic is the name. You can find it at Red Door Magazine. It has over 100 collections, 100 recordings of poetry from all over the world. So It's not just in English and it's not just in Spanish. It is in so many languages and in so many voices. And my goal is at some point to be able to organize it, not just alphabetically and by region, but also by the subjects that we're all talking about, because ideally that will give us a mapping, not just of where we are and what we are creating, but what are we facing, and possibly guide us towards solutions for us as communities everywhere in the world in these current times. That completes my never stop circle of life. What I have actually learned from all of this is that the tools that are provided me, like the technologies out there, they're not exactly my enemy, even if I don't love them. Social media, for example, some people adore them, but for me, I'm not a huge fan. But I have learned to use them to my benefit, to keep in touch with our entire network of friends and translators all over the world, and also to promote, of course, my own projects. The digital creating facilitates, for example, with music and with illustrations, the creating good resolution images that you can send your publishers or create posters and continue the what you would call guerrilla marketing of projects, which actually skips the middleman and allows you to build a direct audience. And I have now tapped into Patreon also, because I believe that even if Facebook were to freeze or crash or anything, I would still be able to deliver more exclusive content to my own audience. So you can find me on patreon.com/Madam Neverstop. Reddoormagazine.com is where you find most of the other projects. And I will have one last poem to complete the story of the activities. I hope that this sharing of my story gives you not just a little peek into who I am, but also what I have to offer for you, and how I too maybe can help you, from translations to poetry to publications in the magazine to the phonotech. I want to also document your story, and I also want to help you find other communities and learn of the communities that you are a part of, because that will make us much more beautiful present, a much more beautiful international group of weirdos willing to fight and resist the coldness of our world. So with that, I'm gonna read you a last poem called Transgressions for the Public Service. And that one came out also with Moloko as a CD, which I have here, and also as a limited edition cassette, because cassettes are cute. Therefore. So, Transgressions for the Public Service. The simple things need no explanation. They have very little in common with the language we use to mimic formal communication. It matters not whether we believe, we proceed, we inhibit, we keep to ourselves, we try, we say never mind, we keep safe distance, we jump to abyss in weekly loop. We make ourselves better based on book of instructions. We remember, we release it, we fix it, we make it doable, we dismiss it. We declare war, apologize profusely, or act like it's never been there, We dance to songs that speak about it without leaving public traces. We read it on the news or pretend it lets us sleep. It matters little whether or not its parts are visible, whether or not others can see them, whether or not we dare to caress them. I know of some who spent a whole lifetime telling stories to cover up the facts for the sake of entire worlds of numb, basic, safe existence. There are tales we never need to let go of. There are rivers we never move on from. There are voices and silences and shattered pieces of glass within the scheme, and Sunday nights, and phone calls that never happen, and uncomfortable interactions, animal footprints and catastrophes and winters we need not recover from. There's one image of you and maybe more. But see, the ritual consists of repetition. It matters not whether we howl or I replay in my head the things that aren't. The music is still louder. The rivers never stopped flowing. The light always got in, somehow. The music is still louder. The rivers never stopped flowing. The light always got in, somehow. The light always got in, somehow. The light always got in, somehow. The light always got in. The light always got in. The light always got in, somehow. Cut.
Wonderful.
Oh,
Thank you.
me